Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore the moment Yuri surprises Tu Tieu with a peaceful coastal getaway, then misses. Nia quietly places a special heirloom in her hands and whispers, "Take it, so you remember you belong." If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. Tu Tieu had packed and unpacked 3 times before Uri even finished making coffee. Each time, she folded a sweater, placed it in the suitcase, then pulled it out again, like the fabric had suddenly become suspicious. She told herself it was normal, people forgot things, people overthought. But she wasn't really thinking about clothes. She was thinking about what it meant to leave the house, while everything inside her still felt fragile. Yuri leaned against the counter, watching her with a patience that never sounded like pity. He didn't say, "Stop worrying." He didn't say, "You're fine." He just waited until her hands slowed. "Hey," he said gently, "come here." She paused, and he held up a small wooden box, the same one from their healing day. He placed his phone inside first, like an old ritual of trust. Then he looked at her. "Soft phone free," he said. "We'll keep the map. We'll check in if we need to. But the rest, we let it go for a while. What if something happens?" Yuri's eyes stayed calm. "Then we handle it. But today we're not planning for fear. We're planning for peace." Peace. The word still felt like a language she was learning late in life. Mrs. Nia entered the kitchen with a small tote bag in her hand. It looked like a bag that had carried 1,000 ordinary things: extra tissues, hard candy, spare buttons, the quiet wisdom of mothers everywhere. She set it on the table and began placing items inside with calm precision. A small container of snacks, a travel-sized bottle of hand sanitizer, a pack of ginger mints, and a neatly folded list written in her careful handwriting. Uri raised a brow. "Mum, you're outfitting us like we're crossing a desert." Mrs. Nia gave him a look. "Coastal air makes people hungry." Tu Tieu laughed, an easy sound that still surprised her. Mrs. Nia glanced at her and smiled, pleased, as if she'd just heard the house breathe again. Then Mrs. Nia stepped closer to Tu Tieu, straightened the collar of her sweater, and smoothed a wrinkle near her shoulder. But it landed in Tu Tieu's chest like a soft weight. "And you will be okay." Tu Tieu's throat tightened. "Are you okay alone?" Mrs. Nia patted her hand. "I am not alone. I have my tea, my morning sun, and my stubborn son who calls me twice a day." Yuri groaned. "Twice?" Mrs. Nia's eyes twinkled. "3 times." Tu Tieu smiled again, but her eyes stung. She turned slightly so no one would see. At the door, Uri grabbed the keys. He paused and looked back at his mother. "We'll be back in 2 days." Mrs. Nia nodded. "Go, let your heart stretch." Tu Tieu hesitated on the porch, the pendant bundle tucked safely in her bag. Mrs. Nia leaned in and whispered, so quietly it felt like a blessing, "If you feel scared, hold his hand and name 3 safe things you see." Tu Tieu nodded, unable to speak. Uri opened the passenger door for her like it mattered. She slid in, hands folded in her lap. And just like that, the trip began. The road was ordinary grey asphalt, familiar intersections, a few sleepy neighborhoods waking up. But the air changed as the city thinned. The sky widened, the light became cleaner. Yuri turned on music oldies at first. Something soft and steady that sounded like the past in the best way. Tu Tieu stared out the window, watching the world pass as if it were proof that life could keep going without her monitoring every detail. After about 30 minutes, Yuri asked casually, "How are you doing?" Tu Tieu opened her mouth, then closed it. The honest answer was too complicated. Uri didn't push. He just reached for her hand and held it over the center console. A quiet anchor, they stopped at a small coastal diner just before the shoreline road began. It had sun-faded signs, booths with worn red vinyl, and a pie display case that looked like it belonged in a movie. A waitress with silver hair and a warm voice approached. "Well, aren't you two a cute pair? What can I get you, honey?" Tu Tieu blinked at the word honey, not because it was strange, but because it was normal. Unthreatening. Uri ordered coffee and clam chowder, and a slice of apple pie, he added, glancing at Tu Tieu. For the road. Tu Tieu started to protest. "I don't. You do," Uri said gently. "We're doing comfort on purpose." When the pie arrived, it was warm, cinnamon heavy, and smelled like safe kitchens. Tu Tieu took a bite, and something in her face softened without permission. Uri grinned. "There it is." "There what?" she asked, cheeks full. Back on the road, the ocean finally appeared first, as a distant blue line. The air came through the vents with a hint of salt, clean and sharp. Tu Tieu stared, stunned. "It's louder than I expected." Uri smiled. "The ocean doesn't whisper, it tells the truth." The coastal inn was small and charming. 2 stories, white trim, weathered wood, and hanging flower baskets swaying in the breeze. A porch wrapped around the front like open arms. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and warm linen. The lobby had a fireplace, even though it wasn't cold, and shelves lined with old books. A bowl of peppermint sat on the counter like someone's grandmother had arranged it. The receptionist handed Uri a key card and a small paper map. Room 12. Ocean view. Ocean view. Tu Tieu didn't speak until they opened the door. The room was simple, cozy, and bright. A quilted bedspread, a small table with 2 chairs, and a window so large it made the ocean feel like it was right there, like the world had opened its arms and said. Tu Tieu stepped forward, then stopped at the edge of the rug like she didn't want to disturb the calm. "It feels unreal." Uri set their bags down and stood beside her. "Let it be real." Tu Tieu reached into her bag and pulled out the bundle Mrs. Nia had given her. She opened it carefully, revealing the pendant in its little case. For a moment she just held it, breathing. Then she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beside it, Mrs. Nia's handwriting. Tu Tieu opened it with trembling fingers. "If you feel scared, hold his hand and name 3 safe things you see." Her eyes filled instantly. Uri noticed. Of course he did. He didn't ask questions. He simply took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, as if answering the note without needing to read it. Outside, the ocean rolled and sighed against the shore, and for the first time in a long time, Tu Tieu didn't feel like she was running. She felt like she was arriving. The next morning, Tu Tieu woke up before her fear did. For a few precious seconds, she didn't remember the old tension in her shoulders. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't scan the room for danger. She only heard the ocean. The curtains moved slightly with the coastal breeze, and pale light poured across the quilt. Uri was already awake, sitting by the window with 2 mugs in his hands. He looked over and smiled, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "And, Coco, just in case you want comfort instead." Tu Tieu sat up, hair messy, eyes still soft with sleep. "How did you know?" Uri's smile widened. "I've been paying attention." She took the cocoa. Warm, sweet, familiar. Something she might have loved as a kid. They sat by the window in silence for a while, watching the world move slowly, seagulls gliding, distant walkers on the sand, the tide pulling itself back like a curtain. Finally, Uri spoke. 3 deep breaths. Tu Tieu glanced at him. "Is this your new thing?" "It's our new thing," he corrected. They inhaled together, exhaled together, 3 times. Then Yuri asked, "One thing you're grateful for, right now?" Tu Tieu looked down at the mug in her hands. "That my hands are warm," she said quietly, "and that nobody needs anything from me this second." Yuri nodded. "That's a good one." They walked down to the beach after breakfast. Nothing intense, just a slow stroll along the shoreline. Tu Tieu wore a light jacket, and the pendant lay hidden beneath it, resting near her heart like a private promise. The sand was cool, the air crisp. Yuri carried their shoes in one hand, like he'd decided they were officially a barefoot kind of couple now. Tu Tieu watched the foam curl around their feet. "It keeps coming back," she said. "The tide?" Yuri asked. "Peace," Tu Tieu answered, surprising herself. Yuri didn't tease. He only squeezed her hand. "Yeah," he said. "It does." They stopped at a little seaside shop, later postcards, magnets, seashell wind chimes. The kind of place older couples loved, where the owner smiled like they'd known you forever. Tu Tieu picked up a postcard with a watercolor lighthouse on it. Yuri picked one with a simple ocean horizon. "My mum." Tu Tieu's throat tightened. Of course he was. They sat at a small outdoor table beside the shop, pens in hand. Yuri wrote slowly, thoughtfully. Tu Tieu watched the way his brow furrowed slightly. Like every word mattered. She finally looked away and began her own. That felt too distant. "Mum?" Her hand froze. Yuri noticed her pause, but he didn't speak. He didn't rescue her from her own heart. He simply kept writing, giving her space to arrive in her own time. Tu Tieu swallowed, then wrote again. "Mum, thank you for choosing me. Thank you for giving me something to hold when I didn't know how to feel safe. I'm trying. I'm staying." Her eyes blurred. She blinked hard, unwilling to let tears fall on the ink. Yuri finished first. He turned the postcard over and smiled, then slid it toward her just enough for her to see. "Mum," she smiled today. Real smiles. Thank you for giving her a home to return to. We're by the ocean. We're breathing. We'll be back soon. Tu Tieu pressed a hand to her chest, as if the words had become physical. They mailed the postcards at the little box outside the shop. Yuri dropped his in first. Tu Tieu followed, her fingers lingering for half a second before letting go. That afternoon, they sat on the inn's porch in 2 rocking chairs with a small bowl of peppermints between them. Tu Tieu rocked slowly, watching the street tourists passing, a dog trotting by, someone laughing in the distance. Yuri said quietly, "You're quieter today." "In a good way." Tu Tieu nodded. "Sometimes peace makes me nervous," she admitted. "Like, I'm waiting for it to be taken." Yuri leaned toward her. "Peace is a new muscle," he said. "It shakes when you first use it, but we build it." Tu Tieu stared at the horizon, eyes wet. "What if I don't know how to be normal?" Yuri's voice didn't flinch. "Then we make our own normal. Slowly, kindly." As evening fell, they returned to their room. Yuri turned on soft music, something old and slow, a song that sounded like a warm living room in December. Tu Tieu stood near the window, watching the last light fade over the water. "One dance?" Tu Tieu laughed nervously. "Neither was peace. We're learning." They danced in the small room, no fancy steps, just swaying. Tu Tieu's head rested near Yuri's shoulder. His hand stayed steady at her back, as if he was telling her body it didn't need to brace. "Good," he said. "That's the point." Near just a short video call, her face filled the screen, wrapped in warm lamplight, cardigan buttoned, hair neatly brushed. "There you are," Mrs. Nia said, smiling. "Did you eat?" Yuri laughed. "Yes, Mum." Mrs. Nia looked at Tu Tieu. "Are you sleeping?" Tu Tieu nodded. "Better than I expected." Mrs. Nia's eyes softened. Good. The ocean is good medicine. There was a small pause, the kind where a heart decides whether it's ready to step forward. Tu Tieu swallowed. Good night, Mom. Mrs. Nghia's smile didn't widen dramatically. It simply warmed, like a candle catching. Good night, dear, she said. Sleep well. When the call ended, Tu Tieu sat quietly on the edge of the bed, phone face down. Yuri sat beside her, close enough to share warmth. It doesn't feel heavy, she murmured. Uri smiled. Because it's not a burden. It's a belonging. Tu Tieu leaned into him, hands threaded with his. Outside, the ocean continued, its steady work arriving, leaving, arriving again. And Tu Tieu finally understood something simple and powerful. For once, the road hadn't been about surviving. It had been about living. Uri looked at her, eyes soft. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we go home, not back to fear home. Tu Tieu's voice was gentle, brave. Next time, we bring Mum with us. Yuri's grin was pure warmth. Deal. The ocean sighed beyond the window, like it approved. Yuri surprises Tu Tieu with a coastal inn getaway not to escape, but to rediscover peace. Before they leave, Mrs. Ngia packs snacks and a note. If fear rises, hold Uri's hand and name 3 safe things. On the drive, they try soft phone-free hours, stop at a diner for chowder and apple pie, and reach an ocean view room that finally lets Tu Tieu exhale at last. The next morning, they share cocoa by the window, take 3 deep breaths together, and walk barefoot along the shoreline. They buy postcards. Yuri writes to his mother, and Tu Tieu addresses hers as Mom, thanking her for choosing her. That night, they slow dance, call Mrs. Ngia, and Tu Tieu whispers, "Good night, Mom," hearing warmth back. Holding the heirloom close, she realizes for once this trip is learning to live, not run away.